If you were online during the 2016 Democratic primary election cycle, you can probably recall that there were constant, brutal fights between Hillary Clinton supporters and Bernie Sanders supporters. Now, there were also fights going on between supporters of Republican candidates. I can recall very intense flame wars between Trump supporters and Ted Cruz supporters, for instance. But sticking with the Democrats, you could almost write like a 12-volume treatise on everything that went on Twitter alone between Bernie supporters and Hillary supporters throughout that cycle. It was extremely intensive. And some of those fights still rage on today, although they've taken differing forms. But this cycle, you have a little bit of a weird dynamic. Obviously, there are many more candidates, so you can't quite as easily dichotomize the factions of support as you could have in 2016. But it's still weird because the candidate who leads the polls for the Democrats consistently hasn't really changed in the past 5 months. Doesn't seem to have anyone vocally supporting him online. Have you noticed that? Now, maybe I'm in a bubble, and I do spend a lot of time on Twitter, God help me. But I have not really encountered any energetic or enthusiastic Joe Biden supporters. And I've heard many others make the same observation. Now, you'd expect if Joe Biden is leading the polls both nationally and in the early states, that there would be at least some vocal contingent of his supporters online with whom you could fight if you felt moved to do so, right? There's always fights going on, especially in primaries and in every other facet of political life. That's just sort of how Twitter in particular works, although, Facebook kind of lends itself to fights amongst family and friends and such, which is why I don't participate. But I am known to participate in a Twitter brawl here and there, and there's nobody to brawl with if you want to throw down with a Biden supporter. There's just nobody out there. Now you have Kamala supporters fighting with Tulsi supporters. You have Bernie supporters fighting to some extent with Kamala supporters, and even to a degree Warren supporters. So it's not as if everything is hunky-dory online in the Democratic primary. But there's just no action with respect to Biden. Can you name to me a YouTuber, for instance, who is known to be a Biden supporter? Can you name any prominent Twitter personalities who are really gung-ho for Biden? I can't. And you can't attribute it entirely to the fact that Biden draws outside support among older voters who are less likely to use social media, because the same was true of Hillary in 2016. She was obviously favored among older voters, whereas Bernie had generated a large amount of support from, let's say 30 and under. But still, there were plenty of 30 and under and, maybe somewhat older, but still tech literate Hillary supporters who you could wage war against if you really wanted to. And it's just not available now with regard to Biden, and it's a strange dynamic. Because Biden trudges along in the polls. There was a new one today from CNN, which showed him basically with more support than the next two competitors combined. That's nationally. And you can't discern any of that support on the internet virtually. Now, maybe I'm exaggerating to some extent, and there are people here and there who support Biden on Twitter or whatever, but it's not as though it's anywhere near the same kind of dynamic from 2016 when, there was always somebody to squabble with if you were in the Bernie-Hillary divide. Now, why might that be the case? How do you explain that? Well, the people who were drawn to Hillary, for example, in 2016 and who were vociferously backing her on the internet generally did not back her on the ground that she was the most electable. They probably believed she was the most electable, but that wasn't their primary reason for supporting her. They were committed to Hillary. Individually, they liked that she would be the first woman president, obviously, first woman nominee, which she was. They were committed to her brand, so to say. They were enthused about aspects of her candidacy, which drove them to engage online with vituperative trolls who were very anti-Hillary. And, you can make a similar argument for what generated Bernie support. In that, people were enthusiastic about Hillary and Bernie for different reasons. But the main reason why Biden is drawing support now is not because anybody is particularly enthusiastic about him, although you could find some people who are enthusiastic about Biden in a sense, but there aren't really as many who are personally and passionately and emotionally committed to Biden as there would have been with respect to Bernie and Hillary. Biden is getting the support that he's getting in large part, and I've talked to voters who will say this. They believe that he has the best chance of defeating Trump and therefore is the, quote, most electable. And also they kind of have a fond memory of his association with Obama, and they feel like everything was, pretty okay prior to January 20th, 2017. And they kind of are attracted to the idea that restoring the pre-Trump status quo would be the best approach for this upcoming election. And so, if that's your logic for supporting Biden, right? You were more or less okay with the pre-Trump status quo. You kind of vaguely liked him what he did with Obama, although you probably couldn't name a whole lot of accomplishments that he had as vice president. And you think he seems like a reasonably nice guy who could beat Trump. Those aren't really markers of passion. Those aren't indicators of the kind of enthusiasm you'd need to get on Twitter, for example, and fight with trolls all day. So I think that at least partly explains why Biden doesn't have any of these online supporters. But you could also, I think, potentially argue that the lack of online support undermines Biden in a key respect. It means that there isn't as much of a core foundation of enthusiastic supporters that would kind of serve as a bedrock for the Biden candidacy as things go forward. It's not as though you have a really die-hard contingent of people who are, do or die for Biden. We're going to be putting everything on the line for his candidacy, and they're going to take all the attacks and go after his enemies. You don't have that. I mean, and I remember in the 2015-2016 cycle when Donald Trump had by far the most enthusiastic supporters online of any candidate. I remember that being dismissed as inconsequential. And in fact, there were studies put out around that time which showed that Trump provoked the most extreme reaction, both positive and negative, on social media. And, there were ways that you could measure it where Trump did seem to have the most support online of any Republican candidate. And if Trump had only that, obviously you couldn't win a Republican primary, most likely. But it was a factor, I think, in why he took the political system by surprise in the way he did. So I don't think online support ought to be dismissed outright. Obviously, it's a little tricky to measure. You know, to what extent do you assign significance to any one Twitter supporter? You know, it's complicated. But at least in theory, it should be considered as counting towards something if your online support is observably enthusiastic across many mediums. And Biden doesn't have that. So it leads me to wonder whether that actually is a serious liability for him, or the fact that he just has this sort of soft support among high frequency voters. So people say 65 and older who are going to vote for Biden, but not for any passionate reason other than that they passionately hate Trump and want him gone and want the best person available to achieve the ouster of Trump. Can he coast by with just those people? Or is it insufficient? Do you have to kind of put together what you might call sort of like an enthusiasm coalition, where you have this, base of very highly motivated and intensely engaged supporters on top of a sort of constellation of less motivated voters? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that, but I think it's something to keep an eye on. And I also would not dismiss Biden's polling lead. Is it potentially soft? Sure. But, I mean, wouldn't you have expected it to soften somewhat by now after he's been under relentless attack in the media and among his rival candidates for several months? There's been not really any significant change since he announced his campaign. So, I don't know. I'm not going to pretend that I have any conclusive answer, but it is something that is noticeable. And I have to just preemptively push back on people who are going to claim in the comments, inevitably, that the polls are all fake. Look, the polls aren't fake. I know I'm going to get attacked for saying that, but they're simply not. I don't know why everybody has to kind of convert into these statistical nihilists when there are polling results that they don't like. It doesn't mean that you herald every single poll as kind of unimpeachably accurate. It doesn't mean that there aren't problems with how polls get portrayed and framed, which there are. But, breaking news, the national polls in 2016 were reasonably accurate. There was only a 1.2% polling error if you look at the Real Clear Politics average of all national polls just before the election and compare it to the popular vote result. Now, was there error in state polls? Yeah. For example, there weren't even a whole lot of polls, period, done in Wisconsin leading up to the election because nobody really thought it was in contention. So that's an error of its own kind. And the polls were definitely off in Pennsylvania and Michigan. But it wasn't as though polling as a whole was useless in 2016. I used polling analysis in 2016 to scream to people that these polls were, for a variety of reasons, telling us that Trump had a much greater chance of winning the election overall than most assumed. And that was because you could look at polls showing that Hillary had attracted a relatively small percentage of Bernie Sanders supporters to come to her aid during the general election. It was because there was less support for Hillary among black voters than there had been for Obama in 2012. There were a whole variety of metrics you could look at using polling data to give you insight into what the outcome would be that were useful then or are going to be useful now. Should you be critical when you're assessing polls? Yeah. Should you not take everything at face value? Sure. Should you be extra suspicious of how, kind of self-interested pundits wield polling results to further whatever their agenda is? Absolutely. But to just dismiss polling overall? No. I'm sorry. That's just foolish. There are polls now that show Biden with a fairly commanding lead that use a wide variety of metrics. The CNN poll today that showed Biden with again with the national lead, had a small sample size, 400 respondents. But there are other polls that show Biden with a comparably large lead that have vastly more respondents, to the point where you can go and look at the Morning Consult tracking poll. That's got 17,000 plus respondents. So how's that for a sample size? And it has a roughly similar result for Biden. And we're not talking about purely landlines here either. The Morning Consult and other polls now are online only, and they're reasonably reliable. So I don't want to hear about this polling fatalism or nothing matters, or I'm just going to ignore this entire field of data science because it's stupid. Okay? If you don't like the fact that Biden's leading in the polls, try to understand why he's leading the polls and address those reasons rather than just dismissing polls writ large. That's not going to help. All right. I will talk to you later.